Did you really think you could just walk in here and take this?
You really should watch your tone, Julian.
I'm just saying, 6 straight quarters of double-digit growth don't happen by accident. You need a killer at the helm of strategy, and Elena is, without question, a killer. She's relentless. We put her on the EMEA restructuring last winter, and half the board thought she'd burn out. Instead, she streamlined 3 logistic divisions in 90 days. Well, she has the freedom to be relentless, doesn't she? Freedom is everything in executive leadership. Some of us go home to spouses who run their own firms, managing 12-hour days, competing for who gets the quiet study on Sunday afternoons. It's an adjustment. So, how does it feel living in her shadow? It's comfortable. It's warm. Fair enough, man. Takes a certain kind of guy. No shame in taking the back seat.
I think it's time they knew the truth.
Elena, don't.
No. We're done with this.
Glasses clinked against fine crystals. Low jazz floated from the speakers near the mezzanine, filtering through the ambient hum of 70 executives and their spouses, celebrating a fiscal year of historic profit. I'm just saying, 6 straight quarters of double-digit growth don't happen by accident, Julian said, slicing cleanly into his dry-aged ribeye. He chewed, swallowed, and leaned forward, his polished cufflinks catching the warm glow of the chandelier. You need a killer at the helm of strategy, and Elena is, without question, a killer. At the far end of the executive table, Elena offered a quiet, practiced smile. She didn't look up from her napkin, though her fingers brushed against the stem of her wineglass. She's relentless, Marcus chimed in from across the linen, motioning with his fork. We put her on the EMEA restructuring last winter, and half the board thought she'd burn out. Instead, she streamlined 3 logistics divisions in 90 days. Well, Julian said, turning his gaze slowly down the table, his eyes settling on David. She has the freedom to be relentless, doesn't she? David held his fork motionless over his plate. He sat in his tailored charcoal suit, an off-the-rack piece fitted precisely by a local tailor down the street from their home, his shoulders relaxed, his expression mild. Freedom is everything in executive leadership, Julian continued, tilting his head with a slight, knowing smirk that barely lifted the left side of his mouth. Some of us go home to spouses who run their own firms, managing 12-hour days, competing for who gets the quiet study on Sunday afternoons. It's an adjustment. Sarah, seated next to Marcus, shifted uncomfortably in her chair, lifting her glass to take a slow, deliberate sip of water. Across from her, Tom caught his breath, glancing down at his plate. Julian leaned back in his chair, swirling the last inch of Pinot Noir in his glass. So, Julian said, his tone casual, dropped into the space between them like a coin dropped into a quiet well. How does it feel living in her shadow? The ambient noise of the surrounding tables seemed to recede into a distant hum. The silver forks at the executive table stopped mid-air. Marcus froze, his glass poised halfway to his mouth. Sarah looked immediately toward the white table linen, her lower lip pulled inward. Elena's hand locked on her glass. The color drained from her face, leaving her cheekbones sharply defined under the ballroom light. She turned her head toward David, her lips parted slightly, a sudden, desperate panic behind her eyes. David didn't flinch. He slowly set his fork down against the rim of his plate, with a soft metallic click. His left thumb reached instinctively across his lap, finding the band of simple yellow gold on his ring finger, twisting it twice around the knuckle, a habitual, quiet movement hidden beneath the table edge. He looked at Julian. His eyes were steady, entirely devoid of anger. "It's comfortable," David said softly. The corner of his mouth twitched into a polite, modest smile. "It's warm." Julian gave a short, patronizing chuckle, taking a slow sip. "Fair enough, man. Takes a certain kind of guy. No shame in taking the back seat." Silence hung thick over the table, suffocating and sharp. Elena stared at David. Her heart was visibly hammering against the collarbone revealed by her dark emerald dress. She looked at Julian, then around at the 6 colleagues who were now studiously looking anywhere else, at their watches, their wine, the velvet drapes hanging along the perimeter of the ballroom. Her voice came out low, raspy, cut through with an emotion none of them had ever heard from the vice president of strategic growth. "I think it's time they knew the truth," Elena said quietly. David turned to her, his hand still gently resting on his ring. "Elena, don't." "No," she said, her voice rising just enough to lock every eye at the table onto her. "No, we're done with this." Looking back, I should have known that dinner would change our marriage, or at least force us to dismantle the quiet architecture we'd built over 7 years to protect it. When you work as a marriage counselor, as I have for nearly 2 decades, you learn that every long-term relationship eventually develops a public currency and a private currency. The public currency is simple: titles, income, property, visibility. It's what people see when you step out of a car at a holiday banquet or post a summer photograph. The private currency is far more complex. Unwritten debts, invisible labor, sleepless nights, unspoken compromises, and the exact weight of who held the floor while the other was drowning. Problems rarely arise because the currencies are unequal. Problems arise when the outside world demands that the private currency be converted into public worth. 3 hours before Julian asked his question, David was standing in our sunlit kitchen in West Hartford, wiping a stray smudge of organic blueberry jam off our 7-year-old daughter's cheek. "Dad, I can't find my green binder," Maya said, her school backpack hanging loose off one shoulder, her sneakers already laced up. "It's in your cubby by the rear door, sweetheart. I packed your violin sheet music in the front pocket," David replied smoothly, not even turning around as he rinsed a cutting board in the sink. He was wearing an apron over his crisp white shirt, his tie draped neatly over the back of a kitchen chair. Elena came down the stairs, her dark heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood. Her blazer was draped over her forearm, her phone pressed between her ear and her shoulder. "I understand the Tokyo team needs the updated deck by midnight, but tell Richard we aren't adjusting the EBITDA projections until we see the final Q3 audit," she was saying into the phone. She paused at the kitchen island, dropping her leather briefcase onto the bar stool. "Right. I'll call him from the car." She pulled the phone away, tapped the screen to end the call, and let out a long, ragged exhale. David handed her a warm travel mug. Without looking, she reached out and took it, pressing her forehead briefly against his shoulder as he leaned in to kiss her cheek. "Thank you," she murmured, inhaling the steam from the dark roast. "Did Maya finish her reading log?" "Signed and packed," David said softly. He reached down, adjusting the collar of her silk blouse where it had tucked inside herself. "How are you feeling about tonight?" Elena sighed, taking a quick sip. "It's the annual gala. It's fine. It's 4 hours of small talk, listening to Harrison pretend he thought of the supply chain overhaul himself, and trying to keep Julian from talking about his portfolio." "Sounds thrilling," David smiled. He reached for his wedding ring, his thumb habitually rolling the band of gold around his skin. Once, twice, 3 times. Elena noticed the gesture. She paused, setting her mug down on the quartz countertop. She reached out and placed her palm over his hand, stopping the movement of his fingers. "You don't have to go if you're tired, David," she said gently, her eyes softening as she looked up into his face. "Really, I can make an excuse. Say Maya had a mild fever." "I'm not missing your recognition night," David said quietly, his voice firm and grounding. "You earned this award, Elle. 3 years of 70-hour weeks. You deserve to sit at that head table. It's just, those people," Elena hesitated, looking down at her polished fingernails. "They don't know you. They don't know us. They see things through a very narrow lens." "Let them," David chuckled lightly, leaning down to pick up Maya's discarded lunchbox. "I know who I am, and I know who we are. That's enough for me." It had been enough for 7 years. 8 years ago, David had been a senior principal structural engineer at a top-tier regional infrastructure firm. He was 34, pulling down a comfortable 6-figure income, managing bridge restoration projects across 3 states, and on track for equity partnership. Elena was a senior manager at a global management consultancy, working grueling hours, traveling 4 days a week. Then came the year Maya was born. It wasn't a single catastrophic moment, but a slow, cascading series of events that forced their hand. Maya was born 6 weeks premature, with a severe pulmonary complication that required specialized home respiratory therapy, around-the-clock monitoring, and weekly visits to specialists 40 miles away. 2 months later, Elena's mother was diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia. The math was brutal. Not financial math. They could have stretched to pay for full-time home health nurses and private nannies, but human math. One night, sitting on the floor of their nursery amidst the hum of oxygen concentrators and half-unpacked boxes, David had looked at Elena. She was crying quietly, her laptop balance sheet glowing in the dark room, torn between a career-defining promotion to director and the terrifying fragility of the newborn in her arms. "I'll step back," David had said simply. Elena had stared at him, stunned. "David, no. You love your work. You're 2 years away from partner." "I love bridge design," he said, taking her hand. "But bridges can wait 5 years. Maya can't. Your career is at a launchpad moment, El. If you pause now, they'll sideline you forever. If I pause now, I can consult on the side, run the house, and make sure our daughter grows up whole. We are a team. We play the hand that wins for the family." It was a quiet, deliberate, radical act of sacrifice. It was not born out of failure, or lack of ambition, or financial dependence. It was built on the quiet strength of a man secure enough in his own skin to trade professional accolades for the unseen, unglamorous foundation that allows a family to thrive. Over the next 7 years, Elena climbed the corporate ladder with meteoric speed, rising from director to senior vice president, her income quadrupling. David took on local, part-time structural consulting from a home office, spent countless afternoons in pediatrician waiting rooms, learned how to braid hair, managed the household finances, built a custom workbench in the basement, and ensured that when Elena walked through the door at 8 p.m., after a crushing day of corporate warfare, the house was warm, the food was cooked, and her life was entirely intact. To the outside world, however, the narrative was far simpler. Elena was the power executive, David was the husband who stayed home, and in a world that measures a man's value almost exclusively by his tax return and his title, that simplicity was a dangerous spark waiting for a dry room. The grand ballroom of the Bellevue Hotel was bathed in amber light. Double-height ceilings were draped in silk tulle, and a 4-piece string quartet played subdued arrangements of pop standards in the corner. David held the door open for Elena as they exited the main elevators. She looked striking, her dark hair swept up, her emerald green gown tailored impeccably, her posture straight and commanding. David walked beside her in his fitted charcoal suit, his hand gently touching the small of her back. "Ah, the star of the evening," a voice boomed from the foyer. Harrison, the executive vice president of global operations, stepped forward, his silver hair neatly slicked back. He held a glass of champagne in one hand and extended the other to Elena. "Harrison," Elena smiled warmly, shaking his hand. "Thank you. It's a wonderful turnout. You earned it, Elena." "The board is thrilled," Harrison said, before his eyes shifted to David. His expression softened into a look of polite, somewhat patronizing condescension. "And David, good to see you again. How are things at home?" "Very good, Harrison," David said smoothly, his voice pleasant. "Maya started 2nd grade last month. Keeps us busy." "Ah, right. Wonderful thing, family," Harrison nodded, tapping David lightly on the shoulder twice, a reassuring pat, reserved for children or subordinate vendors. "Good on you for holding down the fort. Truly. Allows Elena to do what she does best." Harrison turned back to Elena immediately, launching into a discussion about the recent regulatory changes in the EU markets. David stepped back slightly, his face maintaining a warm, serene smile. His left thumb brushed over his ring, turning it slowly. "You okay?" Elena murmured quietly under her breath, taking a brief pause from Harrison's monologue. "Never better," David whispered back, winking at her. "Go get 'em." They moved toward table 4, the executive table near the stage. As they sat, Elena introduced David to the rest of the leadership team. There was Marcus, a quiet, analytical VP of finance who gave David a genuine, respectful nod before returning to his salad. Sarah, a sharp-eyed director of marketing, who engaged David in a brief, pleasant conversation about Hartford's public school district. And Tom, a junior partner who seemed perpetually nervous and spent most of his time checking his phone under the rim of the table. And then there was Julian. Julian was 38, newly recruited from a rival firm in Manhattan to head up corporate acquisitions. He possessed the sleek, predatory confidence of someone who had never experienced a setback he couldn't talk his way out of. His suit was bespoke Savile Row. His watch was an Audemars Piguet that caught the light whenever he lifted his fork. "So David," Julian began, 30 minutes into the second course, leaning over his plate, his tone dripping with pleasant curiosity. "Elena tells us you do consulting work." "I do," David said, taking a small bite of his roll. "Structural analysis for residential and light commercial restorations. Keeps me flexible." "Flexible," Julian repeated, nodding slowly, as if testing the word on his tongue. "Right. That must be nice. I can't imagine having flexibility. If I'm not on a plane 3 days a week, my division loses momentum. But I suppose somebody has to handle the domestic side of things." Sarah shot Julian a sharp glance, setting her fork down with a slight thud. "Julian, David used to manage regional infrastructure engineering." "Oh, I know." Julian raised his hands in mock defense, laughing softly. "I'm not criticizing. I think it's fascinating, truly. Modern roles, gender fluidity in the workforce. It's great." Elena turned her head sharply toward Julian. "Julian, David chose to pause his full-time career so our daughter could have a parent at home during a critical health issue, and so I could take the VP position." Julian smiled, taking a slow sip of his wine. "Of course, Elena. And it worked out brilliantly for you. Look at you. You're receiving the Chairman's Leadership Award tonight. It's a magnificent trade-off." He turned back to David, his eyes narrowing slightly, an amused, superior smirk curling his mouth. "I just always wonder about the dynamic," Julian said, his voice dropping into that quiet, conversational register that carried perfectly across the table. "Most men I know in our industry, their ego couldn't take it. To be the partner who makes 15% of the household income. To have your wife be the primary breadwinner, the one everyone knows, the one in the press releases." The table went quiet. Sarah looked horrified. Marcus cleared his throat awkwardly, suddenly very interested in his napkin. Julian set his glass down, leaning in just an inch further. "So, how does it feel living in her shadow?" The silence at table 4 felt like a physical weight, dropping onto the surrounding atmosphere until even the clinking of nearby glassware seemed hushed and muted. Elena felt the blood rush to her ears, a roaring hum that drowned out the ambient jazz quartet. She looked at Julian, whose smirk remained locked in place, a calculated provocation, dressed up as casual cocktail banter. He expected David to get defensive, or perhaps to stammer out an explanation of his past accomplishments, or maybe to offer a self-deprecating joke to diffuse the tension. Instead, David looked at Julian with an extraordinary, quiet calm. He unclasped his hands under the table, where his thumb had been rhythmically tracing the golden contour of his wedding ring. He sat up slightly, rested his forearms on the edge of the table, and looked straight into Julian's eyes. "It's comfortable," David said, his voice level, warm, and utterly unbothered. "It's warm." Julian's smirk wavered for a fraction of a second, caught off guard by the total absence of shame or anger in David's response. He recovered quickly, letting out a short, hollow laugh. "Fair enough, man," Julian said, waving a dismissive hand as he picked up his fork again. "Takes a certain kind of guy. No shame in taking the back seat." David smiled politely, turned slightly, and picked up his water glass, taking a slow drink. He was fine. He truly was. Over 7 years, David had wrestled down his own quiet demons, conquered the social anxieties of polite suburban parties, where men defined themselves by their job titles, and forged a deep, unshakable peace with the life he had chosen. He knew what he was worth. He knew what he had built in his home, in his daughter's bright, healthy eyes, in his wife's unburdened ascent to the top of her profession. But Elena was not fine. She stared at her husband's serene, smiling profile, and a sudden, devastating realization hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't Julian's arrogance that made her throat tighten with tears. It was her own long-standing, quiet cowardice. For 7 years, she had allowed people at work, colleagues, bosses, clients, board members, to assume that David was simply a nice, unambitious guy who drifted into part-time work because he couldn't hack the corporate ladder. She had allowed them to believe that she was the sole engine of their family's success, the brilliant powerhouse carrying the household on her back. She had never corrected them. Not because she didn't love David, she loved him more than her own life, but because in the relentless, masculine world of corporate leadership, it was easier to let the narrative stay simple. It was easier to accept the praise, to play the role of the tireless superwoman, to let her colleagues view her husband as a quiet accessory to her grand career. She had let him sit in that shadow, and because he was strong enough to bear it without complaint, she had let herself forget how much it cost him. "I think it's time they knew the truth," Elena said quietly. David turned to her quickly, catching the sharp, trembling intensity in her eyes. "Elena, don't. It's fine, really." "No," Elena said. Her voice was no longer quiet. It cut across the table like a blade through silk. Marcus stopped chewing. Sarah looked up, her eyes wide. Julian frowned, setting his fork back down. "Elena, what are you doing?" Julian asked, trying to maintain his breezy tone. "I was just ribbing him a little. No offense intended." Elena stood up. She didn't make a scene. She didn't shout. She stood with the quiet, formidable poise that had made her one of the most feared and respected negotiators in the industry. She reached down, took David's hand, and pulled him gently until he stood beside her. "Julian," Elena said, looking down at him. Her voice was crystal clear, carrying beyond their table to the adjacent seating area, where several senior partners were seated. "You ask David how it feels to live in my shadow." "Elena, please," Julian muttered, glancing around as he realized people were turning to look. "It was just a casual comment." "No, let's talk about it," Elena said, her eyes blazing with an unyielding, fierce vulnerability. "Because for 7 years, I've let people in this company believe that I am the reason my family thrives. I've accepted awards. I've taken bonuses. I've let people like you compliment my work ethic and my ability to do it all." She turned to face Harrison, who was watching from 2 tables away. His glass paused halfway to his mouth. 8 years ago, David was a senior principal engineer, Elena said, her voice wavering slightly, before steadying into pure strength. He was on track to make partner at one of the top infrastructure firms in the state. He built bridges, real ones people drive across every single day. She looked back down at Julian. "When our daughter was born 6 weeks premature, with severe respiratory complications, and my mother was diagnosed with dementia in the exact same month, my career was about to stall. I was drowning. I was ready to resign." She tightened her grip on David's hand. David looked at her, his jaw set, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, trying desperately to hold her gaze. "David didn't step back because he lacked ambition," Elena said, her voice echoing softly through the quieted section of the ballroom. "He stepped back because he had the courage and the strength to put his family's survival above his own ego. He walked away from partnership so that our daughter could breathe, so that my mother could die with dignity, and so that I could sit in the executive suite." She looked around the table, at Marcus, at Sarah, at Tom, and finally back at Julian. "Every single deal I have closed, every growth target this company celebrates tonight, exists because David held the line at home," she said. "I don't have a shadow, Julian. I have a foundation. And if you think making less money or taking care of a child makes a man small, then you don't know what real strength looks like." The silence that followed Elena's words was complete. The quartet had stopped playing between sets. The hum of conversation across the surrounding tables had died down to a whisper. Julian sat entirely still. The arrogant smirk was completely gone, replaced by a flushed, deeply embarrassed paleness. He looked down at his plate, opened his mouth as if to offer a clever retort, found nothing, and slowly closed it again. He wasn't destroyed. He wasn't fired. He was simply revealed. A man measuring human worth, with a broken ruler in front of everyone who mattered. Sarah stared at Elena, her eyes filled with an undeniable, fierce respect. She slowly raised her hands and began to clap. A slow, deliberate, sharp applause. Marcus joined in a second later, nodding firmly toward David. Harrison, standing a few yards away, set his champagne glass down on a waiter's tray. He walked slowly over to table 4, his face solemn, entirely stripped of his previous patronizing tone. He reached out his hand to David. "David," Harrison said, his voice resonant and genuine, "I apologize. I've known Elena for 6 years, and I never understood what you gave up for her to be here. That is an extraordinary act of leadership. Thank you for what you've done for her, and frankly, for this company." David looked at Harrison, then down at the extended hand. He didn't gloat. He didn't puff his chest out. He simply reached out and shook Harrison's hand with a firm, steady grip. "Thank you, Harrison," David said quietly. "She's worth every bit of it." The rest of the evening blurred into a warm, surreal haze. When Elena was called to the stage an hour later to receive the chairman's leadership award, she walked up the stairs under blinding spotlights. The applause was thunderous. She accepted the crystal trophy from the CEO, stepped up to the microphone, looked out over the crowd of 300 people, and found David standing near the back of the room by the mahogany doors. "I had a long speech prepared about market expansion and team agility," Elena said into the microphone, her voice carrying clearly through the massive hall. "But tonight, I just want to dedicate this award to my husband, David, the man who built the stage I'm standing on." She lifted the glass trophy slightly toward him. Across the room, amidst the applause of executives, partners, and strangers, David stood tall. His hand was tucked into his pocket, his thumb gently resting against his wedding ring. He wasn't twisting it. The drive home was quiet, but it was the quiet of a storm that had cleared the air, leaving everything sharp, fresh, and clean. It was nearly midnight when David pulled our silver sedan into the driveway. The house was dark, except for the warm porch light and the soft glow of the kitchen window, where our neighbor's teenage daughter was reading on the couch, waiting for us to return. After paying the sitter and checking on Maya, who was fast asleep in her room, her arm draped over a stuffed elephant, her breathing deep and clear, we walked down the hallway into the kitchen. Elena took off her heels, dropping them near the island, and unzipped the back of her emerald dress. She pulled on an oversized gray sweatshirt of David's that she had stolen years ago, wrapping it tightly around herself as she leaned against the quartz counter. David removed his suit jacket, hung it neatly over the back of a chair, and unbuttoned his top 2 collar buttons. He filled a kettle with water and set it on the stove. "You didn't have to do that tonight, Elle," David said softly, leaning his back against the counter beside her, staring down at the polished wood floors. "Yes, I did," Elena replied without hesitation. She reached over, taking his hand, pulling it into her lap. "I should have done it 5 years ago." Julian was just being an idiot. David smiled slightly, looking at her. "I've dealt with guys like him my whole life. Their opinions don't keep me up at night." "It wasn't about Julian, David," Elena said, her voice dropping into a quiet, profound tenderness. She brought his hand to her lips, pressing a kiss against his knuckles, right over the golden band of his ring. "It was about us. I realized tonight that by staying silent when people made assumptions about you, I was letting them rewrite our story. I was letting them pretend that my success was entirely my own, when the truth is, I couldn't have survived those years without you." David looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator and the gentle murmur of the kettle starting to heat up on the stove. "I loved building those bridges, Elle," David admitted softly, his voice carrying the faint weight of a memory he rarely allowed himself to speak aloud. "I loved the math. I loved seeing something I designed stand up against the river for 50 years. He looked toward the hallway leading to Maya's room. But I love our daughter more, and I love you. There wasn't a single day, not one morning when I was packing lunches or driving to clinic appointments, where I wished I was sitting in an engineering review board instead. Elena looked at him, her eyes shining in the soft kitchen light. She reached up, framing his face with both hands, her thumbs tracing the lines around his eyes. Lines earned not from corporate stress, but from laughter, from patience, from years of quiet, steady love. Have you ever sacrificed something important for someone you loved, only to have nobody realize what you gave up? It is one of the quietest pains a human being can carry. Not because we crave praise, true sacrifice rarely asks for an audience, but because it hurts when the world looks at your devotion and mistakes it for weakness. We live in a culture that measures partnership by visibility. We count the income, we applaud the titles, we celebrate the partner who stands at the microphone under the bright lights. But any marriage that endures the weight of time knows that the true strength of a home is rarely built under the spotlights. It is built in the dark, in the quiet, uncelebrated spaces, where one person steps back so the other can stand, where one person holds the frame so the other can be the picture. David reached down, taking Elena's hand from his face, holding it tightly in his own. His thumb moved over his wedding ring, but he wasn't rolling it around his finger in anxious self-doubt. He was pressing it firm and steady against her palm, grounding himself in the quiet, unbreakable reality of what they had built together. "Tea?" he asked quietly. Elena smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder as the kettle began to whistle softly on the stove. "Tea sounds perfect," she whispered.